Welcome to the Rise podcast. I'm Kwesi Millington, and I'm excited about my guest today. And you're going to correct me if I say your name wrong, but I was told how to say it, so I'm going to say it right. Norm DeVarennes.
Correct.
Awesome. Good, good. So, like myself, former police officer with the RCMP, and I'm going to pull out what I've seen from you online, and then you add to your intro as you see fit. You were a police officer for 28 years with the RCMP. Now you're a health and safety enforcement course developer. You're a trainer. You're an author of an amazing book I finished reading. You're a mental health speaker as well, and you've gone through some things. And this is a resilience podcast. So I want to talk about not only building resilience for police officers, but for the general public. So basically, I just want to start by asking you how you got into policing and what that journey was like for you. Why a police officer?
I became a police officer. Well, it all started back when I was really, really young. And where we lived, there was like an old farmhouse, a small community called Grand Dig in New Brunswick, east coast of Canada. And where we lived, there was a really sharp turn, almost like 90 degrees. And back in the late 60s, early 70s, yes, I'm that old. There was a lot, those muscle cars and all that, and a lot of accidents happen. So, of course, who do you see when you have an accident? Well, police officers. And at the time, there was no paramedics. It was just a St. John's ambulance.
Mm.
So I think that kind of piqued my interest a little bit. And then when I was in my, I would say probably mid-teens, I kind of flip-flop between police officer or paramedic. But at the time, to be a paramedic in Canada, you needed 4 years of nursing school and then another, I can't remember, but 2 or 3 years in paramedic school, which was in Calgary, Alberta. And so it was quite a long time for me for studies. So I fought back to a police officer. And for me, the RCMP was what attracted me to the RCMP instead of a municipal police force was probably the adventure of going anywhere in the country. You could go anywhere in the country, be transferred or ask for a transfer. And that was very attractive for me. I was a very curious by nature, even when I was young. So for me to see the whole country and while working was a big attraction for me.
Mm. Okay, interesting. And for some people, I mean, when they think of the RCMP, they think I could be sent anywhere in the country, and that is a negative for a lot of people. So they apply to city forces. I know when I got on, I was born in the '70s, so I'm up there. Not too far from you in age. That was one of the things that people asked me when I applied. Oh, you can be placed anywhere in the country. Are you okay with that? And I was in my late 20s at the time, and I said, yeah, sure, wherever I want to see this country. And like you. To get to work and travel was a bonus. Now, policing has changed a lot. Not only being a police officer, but the way police officers are viewed. And what I've tried to do when I interview police officers or former police officers is bridge the gap. I mean, I think we're still healing that divide between the way policing is perceived and the things that we've seen, whether it's on media or whatnot. And I would encourage anyone, whether you're a police officer or not, to read Norm's book called Invisible Wounds, and you can get it on Amazon, right? You can still get it on Amazon. I like it not only because I related to things as a police officer, but I think what it does is it gives people an insight into the police officer's mindset. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, how did you think of writing that first person viewpoint? You have times where you get right inside your mind and you tell us as the reader what you're thinking. And I think that would really help a lot of people in and out of the profession to understand, okay, this is what goes on in a police officer's mind. And it gave a great insight as to why they do what they do. So tell me about the writing of the book and how it got, where that idea came from for that first person view.
I think, well, if I reflect back on it, I'm not on Facebook anymore for my personal reasons, but it started basically on Facebook when I was still on, like probably 2014, around just a year before I retired. And I was posted in Haines Junction in the Yukon Territory. And when I was seeing, and I'll tell you exactly the trigger point was that I don't know if you remember, but that Toronto police officer that had shot the youth on the bus, on the transit bus in Toronto.
Yes.
A while back, but that was and then I would listen to the comments, and this was before this was even going to court, before all the evidence was out. But anyways, not that I thought that this was a justified shooting. I didn't know the details, and I'm not going to get into that. But I found like there's a lot of people that really didn't understand really how the mind of a police officer works. And I thought the more that I thought about it, I thought, well, maybe I should be the one that actually, put out some articles somewhere to explain exactly how, I guess, how the mind works as a police officer, based from my perspective. So I started writing articles actually on LinkedIn. I got off Facebook. It was I was triggered way too much by what I was reading there. So I started writing articles on LinkedIn, and I wrote a little bit more than 30. I think it was 31 or 32. But it started off really as what I call superficial, but trying to get into it. And then I would get some positive comments from readers, positive posts. And then I don't know why, but in my mind, I said, you know what? If you want the general public to understand, you really have to open up and hold nothing back. And that's when I started to open up a little bit more, probably around article 5 or 6 or 7, around there. And then that's when I started to have a real, like a lot of interaction with a lot of people, from police officers, from retired to still serving, from around the world. I mean, I've gotten some comments back from Poland, from the UK, from Australia, mostly from North America. But I mean, I was kind of like taken aback by seeing this. And then it dawned on me that, you know what, the way I think, or the way my mind went through all that, and how I had to process it, is, I guess it's very similar to other police officers, no matter where you are around the world. Yeah. And after I had done all my articles, I thought, well, what's the next step? And the next step was basically to write a book. It wasn't easy at first. I was trying to do it myself, and I'm far from being an author, like a true author. Yeah. And I finally reached out to this guy in Surprise, Arizona. He was what we called an auxiliary, but back there for the county sheriff, he was a volunteer as for traffic and all that. And his wife was a dispatcher, from what I remember. She was a dispatcher also for the county sheriff. So, because I had tried another local author around here, but the way that the author would bring the articles together in the book was very well written, but it seemed like a little bit more on the fiction side, and I didn't want that. I wanted something that was really raw. Mm-hmm. And this guy here, when he showed me what he could do with my articles, with a couple of probably like a chapter and a half, I looked at it and said, this is the guy. This is the person who's going to put it together. And it took a little bit over a year to put together. But yeah, finally it's out there, and I'm happy that people are reading it and they're finding it insightful. My goal was to try to help people after they read it, give them a little bit more of an insight. It's to, also educate the general public. So it's written that general public can read it and make sense out of it. And I guess that's pretty much how it became a book.
Well, yeah, and I really enjoyed it. And just to your credit, I'm a former police officer, and I enjoy it. My mother picked it up and read a few pages. She has no policing background. She enjoyed it, and she's going to take it from me after this podcast. So she's going to be reading it as well. I want to talk to you. I was reading on page 12, and I'm going to go right to what you said. You talked about police officers being in alert mode, and mm-hmm. we're continually on guard. Explain what that means to you.
Well, as a police officer, and especially today, because we're seeing with the media posts and all that, you see like a lot of police officers getting injured, or even worse, getting shot. And when you think about it, the job of a police officer is that even stopping a vehicle for a simple traffic infraction, you don't know what you're coming to in that vehicle. We don't know if that person is hiding a firearm or a knife or anything. We don't know if that person, just by even checking out the plate number, might not come to the owner of the vehicle. We don't know if the person driving is wanted for serious crimes or whatever. So you automatically, when you stop the vehicle and you start stepping out, is that your eyes are constantly focused on the vehicle to see if there's, well, for me anyways, if there's any movement inside the vehicle. And if there are, especially if there's more than one person, then your alertness goes that next level up and you're super extra careful. So it's almost like, and then you repeat that. I shouldn't say it's almost like, but then you repeat that over the course of an 8-hour, or 10-hour, or 12-hour shift, whatever the department is, what their policy is for shifts. And then you keep doing that over and over again, years after years. And this, I'm just talking about a simple traffic stop, not even going to domestic violence calls, not even going to bar fights, not even going to, shots fired. I had one call where this guy was chasing his girlfriend with an axe in the middle of a street. So, I mean, you're not going in there by saying, I'm just going to talk to this guy, because you don't know. If you find him with the axe, he could use that to hurt you. So, yeah, I mean, that to me is where the mind goes into a next level, and always on alert, always focused on what's in front of you. And that to me is, anyways, well, from talking to my psychologist also, was a great, I guess, how am I going to say that? But the alertness was a big part, I guess, of my PTSD, trying to come down and calm down. And it was up to certain days where I wouldn't even sleep because my mind was racing all the time. It was so used to being on alert. I think, does that answer the question? Because
yeah. And there's a follow-up question to that. I mean, you were diagnosed with PTSD. When did that happen, and how did you come to the realization that you did have PTSD?
I did not think I had PTSD. I thought everything was okay and everybody else was picking on me, and including my wife. And at one point, my wife had to put her foot down and say, you know what, I'm tired of seeing you like this, and it's not healthy for a relationship. I'll counseling, psychologists, probably for a good 10, 12 years. And she said, you know what, if you're not making that step, I'm going to have to leave, because she couldn't help but see me that way. And for us, it was like she had to always walk on eggshells, basically, to watch out what she was saying so it wouldn't trigger me. So I needed help. I didn't realize I needed help, but I made the step to save our marriage. That's how it started. Not because I thought there was something wrong with me, but because I wanted to save our marriage of 20 some years at the time. Even walking, I don't know if I wrote that in the book. I don't remember exactly everything I wrote in the book, but I remember going to that psychologist in Whitehorse in Yukon. And that was back in 2013, I believe, that I went, or it was January, February 2013 or 2014.
Okay.
But the first time I stepped into her office, she introduced herself, of course. And I told her, I said, I've never seen I've never seen one of you guys, and I made sure that the "you" was pretty good. In other words, after a few months, once we got comfortable with each other, she said, "When you said you, I understood right away that she was on the outside, and I was going to be a tough nut to crack." And then I told her, I said, and this is where my mind was, and you can see, is that I said, if you think of putting me off work, I'm walking out that door right now. So even then, I didn't believe, when I think about it, I didn't believe I had PTSD. I was just doing this just to, I thought, yeah, I'll go 4 or 5 sessions and I'll be all right and keep working, blah, blah, blah. But after a while, that's when I realized she actually read me the definition of PTSD, like the medical or psychologist's definition of PTSD. And I can't remember the exact number, but I think there was 3 categories. And it was like, if you have, one of the 5 here, you could have PTSD. Well, for me, in that first section was like 3 out of 5. And then the second was maybe if you have 2 of the 6 or 7, you could have PTSD, but I was up at like 4 or 5. And the last one was if you have like 3 or 4 out of 10 or something like that, you may have PTSD, but I was up at 7 or 8.
Yeah.
And that's when I broke down. I started crying like a baby, because that's almost, even now it chokes me up, because that's where I saw how how screwed up I was. And I shouldn't use that word, screwed up, but I mean, I had really serious mental health issues. And I realized that, and I was like, okay, this is going to take a while before I get better.
And a couple of things you said there that I just want to reiterate is that for me, when I was diagnosed with PTSD, it was the same thing. When I finally found a label for it, it's almost like I could let go. And I don't know if you found that too. I was holding on to the fact that I didn't know what was going on. But then when I was told, okay, for me, it was major depressive disorder and PTSD, it's almost like, okay, I get some of these thoughts I'm having, some of these feelings I'm having now. Did you experience something like that? Or is that why you broke down, or what was it for you?
I never thought of it that way, Kwesi, but I think that is probably the best way to explain it. It was almost like a ton coming off my shoulders. Just like a big, like everything was let go. And I didn't have any control over it, because I had held my emotions inside for so many years that it was almost like the dam had broke, and then boom, everything was coming out at the same time. But you're right. After that, it was almost like, okay, now I've got something to work on now. Now I know.
Yeah, you have a label, you have a target, you can focus. You mentioned, and if you're okay mentioning, your wife is the reason that you were thinking about seeking help, because you didn't think anything was wrong, and you said, okay, to save my marriage. What kind of things were happening that made her say, this is it, you get help or we're done?
What happened is that at one point we were having a get together with the 2 other constables when I was in Beaver Creek in Yukon. It was only a 3-man detachment, and one of the rare time that we were the 3 members together, and we kind of had a little get together, kind of a supper thing together with the guys and the gals, the wives and all that. And they started, like, my wife and another like a citizen from Beaver Creek, a community member, they were talking about something, and it was something about policing, but it wasn't something really bad. But I was talking over there with somebody else, but my ears were kind of like focused on the conversation there, because we were talking about police. And my wife said something, and a community member said something, and I basically snapped at both of them to say they didn't know what the hell they were talking about. And as soon as the words came out of my mouth and I saw my wife's expression, it was like, oh, what did I just say? It was like almost like a snap, and without thinking what I was saying. And then we went home not long after, and that's when she said, I'm done with this. It was more like I was very, very quick with my words, and I didn't take any crap. But at the same time, is that it's good in one way, but another way, in a social gathering outside policing, it's not really good. And that's when I realized I had done something wrong. And because I never physically assaulted my wife, it never came to that point. Did I think about it? Yeah, probably a few times. But it's just, it didn't happen. But it was mostly the way that I would snap back when things were triggered.
So you start that short fuse, and obviously you've been married for a long time. She saw you kind of move to that point. You weren't always short-tempered. It just, over time, she saw you change and said you need help. And you mentioned you weren't physical with her, but you mentioned in your book that you were heavy-handed on the road sometimes, and you would use force that you'd look back on and said, okay, well, maybe that's a little bit too much. One thing that you said that was interesting is that you talked about when people see excessive force on TV, or when they see it in policing, sometimes that's related to PTSD. And I didn't even think about that connection, where you see sometimes these people on TV and just say, okay, that's just excessive force. With your lens, you say, is there PTSD there? Explain how that's related.
Actually, that dates back to, because when I knew what I had, PTSD, and I admit it, like it's almost like an alcoholic admitting that, you know, I've got a problem. When I saw that definition, like, okay, I've got a problem. I need to get fixed. But and that's the way I'm made. I'm a very curious by nature. I needed to understand more about what's going on inside my mind. So I did a lot of research, read a lot of articles, medical journals and all that. But one that really stuck out was a psychologist working, and I can't remember if it was Houston or Dallas, but it was a big police force in Texas. And she had over 20 years of you know, not dealing, but I should say like treating police officers and all that. And her article was PTSD versus police brutality. And she explained the link between the two. And then it made sense to me anyways, because myself, I didn't treat my PTSD until I had like 24 years of service. I had a lot of baggage in the back there. And by the end of my career, when I reflected back on how I reacted when somebody would push the right triggers, and I say right triggers, not to say, oh, that's a good thing, but when they were actually triggering me, I would go from 0 to 10 on the physical side in a millisecond. And then I found out that the reason why I was like that was because of the PTSD that was pushing me to, you know, the mind wasn't, I guess, wasn't calm anymore. So it didn't take much for me to go and snap like that and just react to what was happening in front of me. There's also like, I go deeper in the sense that, you know, with experience, you start to see like a person that you're dealing with when you're talking to them, if they're starting to clench their jaw and you see their muscle, they're moving all the time. Well, you know, they're stressed and there's something bothering them. So then you start to be on your guard. Then you start seeing the fist clenching on the side of their body, you know, and they're starting to change in a stance that's more like a fighting stance. Well, for me, was never a fighter when I was young, I was like shy and non-confrontational. For me, it was like, I better get the upper hand on this guy or this person before they get the upper hand on me. Mm-hmm. So I guess for me, when I see police officers, my first question is, and I'll go back to the Rodney King incident, for example, most of those police officers that did the damage, and again, it doesn't excuse them for what they did, but it does explain why they went up to that point, is that one had 20 some years of service. And first question I would ask that officer, if I was back in the late 80s, is that, did you ever go see a psychologist in your career? And I bet you that the answer would be no. And my point was that, I guess to close it off, is that if police officers, or police organization, I should say, would be proactive and take care of their officers' mental health and well-being, and I'm not talking about, you know, well, if you need psychologist help, we have a department here, blah, blah, blah. I'm talking about the same as police officers. We are required to go to medicals for medical every so many years. Well, why aren't we doing something for the mental health? We all know now, it's no secret that mental health for police officers is a big issue. Mm-hmm. And to me, a mentally healthy police officer or police organization will lower, to me, in my opinion, will lower the police brutality that we see now regularly because of the media platforms. Whether it makes sense or not, that's what I believe. And
I think you explained it so well there. And I like that you said that we're not excusing police behavior, we're explaining it.
Yes.
And it's very important to make that distinction because the part of the public that's angry at police officers and see something and jump to saying, okay, police brutality, they'll probably jump on you if you say, well, that officer might have PTSD, because they'll think you're making an excuse for them. And you're saying, listen, no, this is backed by psychology. I'm explaining the behavior. I'm not excusing it. And I love what you said, and you actually wrote it in your book as well. You said we should have, you know, mental health qualifications like we have pistol qualifications, right? Every so many years, we have to make sure we're still medically fit. We have to make sure we're still physically fit. We're still able to shoot the gun, but why are we not doing the mental health part? And that seems like that's just something that should just be added in. And it seems like it's just tick a box and it should be part of every police organization's protocol. Why is that not happening?
I don't know, because when you look at it in any industry, never mind just policing, in any industry, Right now, I'm working as a health and safety officer, developing courses. If my mind is not in the right place, I am not being a productive employee to this department. Same as police officer, we're human beings. We're no different than somebody, an accountant working in an office. We have a mind of its own. Of course, we all think differently, but the mental health part of it, if we're not mentally healthy, how can we be a productive employee, whether it's a police officer or an accountant? Like I said, you can't. You need to get fixed. You need to go see somebody to help you get through this obstacle, this mental health issue that you have. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think anybody in the world will have mental health issues in their lifetime. Yep. Whether you're a police officer or whether you're a school bus driver or whatever, at one point in time in your life, there will be something happening that will cause mental health issues. And if you don't take the time to resolve it, I mean, you take the time to resolve a broken leg, right?
Yep.
You're taking them off from work, you're going to see the doctor. Why, as human beings, are we saying like, well, no, I don't have any mental health issues, I don't want to see a psychologist? I think it's because we've always seen psychologists and psychiatrists as kind of like, I hate to use the word, but cuckoos.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. You're officially crazy if you see a psychologist. Yeah.
No, it's not the case. And I think that needs to change as well. Like the psychologists and psychiatrists, they're there to help people get through obstacles. I mean, some people are maybe capable of going through some certain mental health issues on their own, and that's great. But sometimes we need a hand, and we need a helping hand, and that's where you go see. And sometimes, for me, sometimes I just go out and have coffee with some of my ex-colleagues, and that's as good as a 1-hour session with a psychologist. But I think a mix of both would be even better.
And it would be, the thing though is that some people, you mentioned they would be okay without a psychologist, but I think in my case, in my case, I thought I was okay without a psychologist. And that's the mistake I made until I saw one, and I ended up seeing her for 9 years. That's a mistake that people make as well, especially in our profession, that A-type, I don't need to see anyone, I'll just go have a drink with my buddies or whatever else, and that will help me get through. But they don't know what they need until they get it. And if it was provided to everyone, there'd be no stigma, because you and I, Norm, we're both on the force. You saw your psychologist last year? Yeah, I saw mine last week. It's okay. It takes away the stigma. Now, there's only 2 reasons I can think why this is not in every police force. Number 1 is there's not enough manpower to have everyone see a psychologist, or number 2, the money involved, they don't want to pay. Talk to me about if you think any of those are valid.
They're very valid, actually. But for the RCMP, and this is where I come back to, is that I don't know if it's still like this now, but I know like up until I retired in 2015, we had the benefit of going to see a psychologist 6 times a year, 6 1-hour sessions a year. That comes down to 1 session every 2 months. So the way I see it, Treasury Board, like we're talking in Canada here, Treasury Board, they give the RCMP so much money or budget, and within that budget is the mental health side of it, which is, I think it's through Veterans Affairs, but the RCMP, they give a bunch of money to Veterans Affairs for mental health. And then, so if they're already paying for it, why aren't we using it? Well, like we've been talking about, it's the stigma behind it. Mm-hmm. And if, to me, this is one way of doing it, it's not the only way, but if to break the stigma right away with a sledgehammer, make it mandatory. Grandfather all the other ones that are already in the force, and the new recruits, that's part of your new employment, not skill, but
your procedures, your protocols, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, an employment condition. You have to see a psychologist every 2 months. Now, if in other police forces, I can speak in Canada, I'm sure they have similar programs, maybe not as many as we have, but they must have similar programs. So why not use that money and do it mandatory for their new officers? And you know what? The ones that are already in the force that want to hop in that program, let them. But the ones that are not, like the old crusty me that used to be, you know what? Leave them alone and let them retire.
Yeah.
you know, and but you know what? I think it's one way to do it. And to me, every 2 months, if you're working in a busy area, that's going to be the amount of time you will need to go every 2 months to flush out everything. And that way, you don't carry a big, hiking pack sack full of rocks in there. Because as soon as the rock starts to be heavy, it's your turn to go back. And the other point you made also is absolutely true, that it could be true, I should say, about manpower. But they do it already for the medical. When I was scheduled to go do my medical, they had to find a replacement for me, because for me, I had to go up to Fredericton when I was in New Brunswick. And that's from Rishabak, it was a couple of hours away. So I needed to go up the night before, so they would lose me for that day. And then I would be up there for the next day for the medical, and then I'd go back. And so I'd miss 2 days of work if I was on shift. So yeah, I mean, it could be, but to me, I think it's still manageable. I mean, how many, and I know you've seen it, Kwesi, is that how many members where you worked in BC before, how many members were on stress leave?
Yeah, more than should be. And
so instead of losing a member for 2 or 3 days for the psychological assessment, if you don't do that, you might lose that same police officer for 6 months or more, 6 months, a year, maybe more.
Or as you said, they might be over the edge mentally, do something on the road, excessive force or whatever, and then they're off for other reasons as well. And you mentioned 2 months, and an officer might think, okay, that's too much, and maybe it is too much, but let's just make it mandatory every 6 months, once every 6 months, something to start with, and make it mandatory for all new recruits. And you're right. I mean, if I remember it was 6 per year that I was allowed, and then I applied for more when I was on the force. So even if you just make it something that's twice a year to start, which isn't enough for what we see, I get that, but something that has everybody seeing a professional, that's something that, I mean, it seems so obvious that, by the time we talk, if we were to talk again next week, this should be in place, but it won't be.
But you know what? And that's the key right there. Like you're saying, it doesn't have to be 6. I was using 6 because I know in the RCMP when I worked, it was like 6 sessions. And you know how many sessions I used in the first 24 years? Zero. So, anyways, and I'm not saying that to brag. I'm just saying how stupid that was. Because
I know. You're saying you should have used it.
But so it could be once a year, but at least that's a foot in the door. It's a beginning. It's a start. And if they, after 5 years, they decide, you know what, once a year is not enough, let's do it 3 times a year. At least it's a beginning, it's starting traction, but I don't see it. I remember reading an article a while back, and I think it was a police force in Illinois, but they were starting a program that was very similar to what we're talking about here. So mandatory and mandatory psych sessions, but I think it was only after like once every 2 years or something like that. But at least I thought, like, well, that's a start.
Yeah. And we'll get to the point where everybody's seen a psychologist. And I think that goes such a long way to removing stigma. There's so many challenges that an officer faces that, well, in any profession you face, but especially a profession where you're seeing bad things all the time. I mean, you talk about in your book calls that I've never seen, things I've never seen, suicide, bodies decomposing, drownings, like the things you've seen in your career, because you spent some time in some much smaller cities and much more violent places than I did. But another issue you ran into was internal management, egos. And I know I have a lot of officers coming to me and saying, hey, listen, it's not just the outside stuff we see. Sometimes that's almost easier than dealing with the internal politics. You conduct training sessions and develop courses. What advice would you give to kind of correct that, or to heal divide internally between organizations?
I can't speak for all the police forces, of course, but in the RCMP, I mean, you're bang on that. I mean, I've had run-ins with or supervisors that really should not have been in that position and were miserable to the employees. but I always thought, I was kind of surprised actually when it came to the point where I was able to get promoted, is that to become, let's say for me, when I became a corporal, I was in charge of 11, depending on the team, but usually 11, 12 constables that were underneath me. And there was another corporal like in the district. So we were two corporals, about, 11, 12 members. I forgot where my train of thought was going with that.
Just
oh yeah, okay, yeah, now
relationships.
Yeah. And then I was surprised that we didn't even have a crash course or something like a 2-week course on how to manage people.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that police organizations should look into, is that not necessarily have a degree in management or human resource, but there are some really good courses out there, week course or 2-week courses out there that are very good, and they kind of wake people up and going like, yeah, I need to treat people like human beings if I want them to follow me, like in a sense that if I am to be respected as a manager, I need to treat my employees or my subordinates like human beings. Mm-hmm. And not like numbers. And I think that's what we see in police organizations, at least in my time, was that some bosses were really, really good, but some bosses were just a number. And it showed. And I remember, I never put that in my book, but I remember when I first started in Joliet, Quebec, this one guy who had worked in Saskatchewan and Alberta and came back to Quebec, his home province, he told me one thing, and it actually turned out to be true. He said, for every good boss you'll have in the RCMP, it'll be followed by a bad one. And every time I can go and track back all my bosses. And when I first started, it was a good boss. Second boss was really horrible.
Yeah.
Arrived in Rishabakto, really good boss, and not so good.
Not so good. I mean, we laugh, but that's kind of sad. And I think that's good for any organization. Some people management courses, like a little something, so that it's more uniform across the board. At least everyone's learning the same thing. So then if they go off and they're an asshole or whatever, then you can say at least they got the course and they just are choosing not to follow things. Exactly. And go from there. If you were talking to someone thinking about becoming a police officer, what advice would you give them? Besides the fact that you should have a psychologist in your back pocket, seeing the times that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been my answer, is just like, make sure you take care of your mental health to have a long career. But the other thing I think I would say was that don't, in a way I'm going to explain after, but don't get married to your work. When I retired from the RCMP, I was so immersed in policing that I really had a really difficult time to find who I was outside of policing. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Perfect sense, yeah.
But, I needed to calm down my mind, because with the help of psychologists, because I'm still seeing a psychologist today. I'm not ashamed to say it. And I probably will still for another couple of years at least. But I think it helped to calm my mind, that I wasn't going to see a danger at every corner that I was going to, because that's where I was at the point of my life, is that, I couldn't even see my wife. I'm afraid of heights. That was even not from PTSD. That was from before, even when I was younger. The PTSD kind of amplified it. But like when we were in the Yukon, for example, we went at Miles Canyon, which is just outside of Whitehorse, and it's a beautiful canyon, and the Yukon River flows through it. And my wife wanted to walk on a trail right beside the ravine, basically, and look at the water. I couldn't even look at my wife. That's how my anxiety would shoot up. My legs would go weak, because all I would see was my wife losing her balance and falling down. Mm. So I had to walk inside more in the trail, like in the woods, so I wouldn't see it. And at the same time, I can't stop my wife from enjoying herself if she feels safe and going. So the only other option was for me to get the hell out of there and look somewhere else.
So it's like that hypervigilance. And the thing for people that are not in the profession to understand is that the reason it's even more important for officers to have that life outside of policing is because on the job, you see things on an everyday basis that remind you of what you do for a living. So you're out on the street and you see dangers, and you're thinking about dangers even when you're off the job. So someone who's a computer technician, for instance, is not necessarily thinking about programming when they're walking on a ravine with their wife, but you're
Exactly.
thinking about dangers. And so since you see those things all the time, it's harder to turn off the policing switch. And I think for first responders, it ends up being that way too, because you may go somewhere, someone asks you a policing question. I don't know if anyone's ever said that to you. Oh yeah, you're a police officer. You know what? I have a friend that did this, da 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 da. I have a friend that's a nurse, and she's the same thing. Every time she's having dinner with friends, they're asking her a health question. So you're always a nurse. You're always a cop. You're not always necessarily a computer programmer or a project manager. So that's why it's even more important in our profession. Is that something that you run into?
I when I was a police officer all the time. I mean, I remember going to like a community supper when I was working in Rishabakto, and people would come and sit right next to you and start asking you questions. Oh, by the way, blah blah blah, and again, policing question, and you're trying to get away from that. You want to socialize like a normal person, but you can't, because you can't get away, and you can't tell these people to go and shove off, because in a way we represent the police force, the RCMP, right?
Mm.
So you don't want to be seen as, that's the way I was. I didn't want to be seen as an asshole that turned off everybody that asked a question. But the more at the time, it really irritated me, but I kept my cool and it was polite. But at the same time, these are people that, when I reflected back, all they want to do is talk to you. They're curious about you. And for them to make a connection in their mind is to talk police, cop shop.
Yeah.
It's not because they want to put you in a bad situation or irritate you. I think they don't know how to interact with certain people. And nurses, for example, like you were explaining, they ask health questions. They want to make a conversation. They want to have something that is common. And that's how a conversation starts. You have something in common. So how do I get to speak about something in common with a nurse? Well, automatically it's a health question. Police officer, police question. Firefighter, fires. Military, same thing. Do you go to war?
Yeah.
I'm sure that person went to war, like let's say 2 tours of in Afghanistan, and they've seen some horrible things. A person asking them, did you ever go to war, automatically triggers all those images again.
Yeah.
So
it's hard to get away from. I get what you're saying. It's just how you bridge gaps and you make connections with people, but sometimes you want to be able to turn it off as well. Mm-hmm. As we come to the end here, and I want to thank you for taking the time with me and just talking about all the issues policing for those in and out of the profession. I always ask people that are officers, what advice would you give to a new officer? But I want to ask another question. For older officers, ones who just want to maybe finish off their last 5 or 10 years and get out of the profession, what can they do to kind of bridge the gap between either the public and policing, or what advice can they give to young officers coming up that might help them, or what can they do for, to promote the profession?
It's a good question. Just I'll have to think about it a little bit more.
Yeah.
I would say, as an experienced police officer, if I base that from me, for example, when I was in Rishabakto, we would get a lot of calls, a lot of files to investigate and all that. And going from a non-contract province, which was in Quebec, and non-contract means that you don't regularly see the RCMP in uniform in Quebec. It's mostly like federal, and same thing for Ontario, actually.
Yeah.
You're doing mostly they're known mostly to do federal laws, including drugs and, customs. And, but if I had to when I talk to new recruits, for example, like in Rishabakto, where we're extremely busy, not to get bogged down, I would tell them and then get more stress on top of the already stress that's already there in the job, is that I always told them, usually January to March in Rishabakto was really slow. It was slower. I should say not slow, but slower. Yeah. So instead of putting your feet on top of the desk and saying, oh, geez, there's not a lot of calls coming up, that's where you really dig into your investigation to stay ahead and keep your head above water. And I remember one recruit that I trained, actually it was my last recruit that I trained before I went to the Yukon. And he thanked me for it, because he actually took it to heart and he rolled with it, and he never, ever was bogged down with too many files. One, of course, I would mention the mental health, but I would again tell them that have a social life. Don't but the social life, maybe it could be to go like on a weekend with your wife, your girlfriend, or just a buddy, and just go outside somewhere like 100 kilometers away where nobody knows you.
Yeah.
Just
Oh.
and that's that's when I enjoyed myself more, is when I went on holidays and I would talk to people, but they wouldn't know it was a police officer.
Yeah.
And
It
it was
gives you a little bit of freedom, right? To not be that police officer first, man second. Just be a person like everyone else. We see things on television, and I'll end with this. We see things on television that, we see little snippets sometimes, and people judge the police, and it's still happening. Oh, they shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have done this. What can the average person do, or I shouldn't say average person, someone without a police training background do when they see something and they're tempted to say, yeah, that's excessive force. I don't like the way they acted there. What can they do to make sure to maybe understand it a little bit better?
I think the most thing, and this is what I've been telling a lot of people actually that has asked me, actually, like just friends and neighbors and whatever, about certain incident that they see on the news. And I basically tell them as simple as this, is that I can't make a judgment. I've got loads of experiences as a police officer. I've done tons of investigations in my career. I can't make a judgment on just a 10-second clip video. So how can somebody with no police background make a judgment when a police officer like myself would experience, that knows how to interpret laws, that knows, use of force, how far you can take it? If I can't make a comment because I don't have the whole story, then you, as a person that doesn't have any police background, how can you make that assessment over a 10-second clip? And I try to do it that way. And some people, they say, oh yeah, I guess you're right. Very, very few actually say, yeah, but, and then they have their, I think there needs to be, it's sad to say in a way, but policing agencies, and I'll try to make it short, but policing agencies are sworn to secrecy. You can't go out there and talk to the public and say, you know what, Norm DeVarennes, I stopped him last night for impaired driving. Boy, was he ever drunk. You can't do that as a police officer. And that actually hurts police agencies, because then the public, especially in today's world, the public, they want to know, they want to see openness. They want to see, you're not hiding anything. So in a way, it kind of worked a little bit against police agencies to be secret and not telling the whole story. Of course, there's reason for it, but there needs to be some type of, I guess, PR thing to be done by police agencies, or maybe even the government, to explain, like, what, police agencies, you can't, it's like CSIS for us here in Canada, comparable to CIA. They just can't go out there and say publicly, we're investigating this person because we think, this person is a terrorist. Until everything's proven and it's out there in court and the person is officially charged, nothing can be made public. And I'm hoping the public will understand this, that there's certain secrecy or something that can't be made available to the public until everything is done, or the whole investigation is done.
Yeah. And that I know that continues to be a problem. It was in my story, and you saw it in your job as well. But I love the way you said that we can't make a judgment on a short clip, and I guess it's something that just we'll continue to work on. I want to thank you for your time. I mean, I appreciate you, and go out, anybody, police officer or not, get Invisible Wounds, read the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and anybody will as well. If people want to find you, how do they find you online?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I've got, there's no secrecy in my LinkedIn account. It's pretty much everything's there. I've got an email too that I've linked to the book, and it's just norm.devarennes. I don't know if you can put letters on your screen or whatever, but it's norm.devarennes, my full name, @gmail.com.
Okay, norm.devarennes @gmail.com. I'll put it in the show notes as well. Some may watch, most will listen. So I'll definitely put it in the show notes as well. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. And thank you for spending a little bit of time with me today.
Kwesi, it was a pleasure, and I'm really happy you reached out to me. Great interview. I enjoyed it thoroughly.